Now that we've discussed an overview of AD RMS and the functionality that it provides and the various components, we're going to talk about deploying Active Directory rights management services in your environment. First things first, we need to discuss the scenarios that warrant the use of AD RMS, and not necessarily that I kind of said that wrong. It's not scenarios that warrant it. It's the scenario that warrants it is we want to apply information protection. We want to extend that protection beyond the traditional means of access control list and encryption, et cetera. And we want a protection that's going to stay resident with the system. What we really mean by scenarios, once we made that choice, then what does our current infrastructure look like? And not only what does our current infrastructure look like, but also, what are the specifics of the scenario look like? Who's going to be publishing? Who's going to be consuming? Those kinds of things, okay? So certainly single forest, multi-forest, you have those. You can use them on an extranet, integrated with ADFS, deployed in Azure. Those are the different scenarios, but let's fill in a little of the gaps. Single forest, so it basically what you're saying, if you want to implement AD RMS just internally, well then that is probably the easiest implementation of AD RMS. Because your AD RMS server can stay internal, it's local, it doesn't have to be accessible from the internet, and all the clients are going to trust it. The server can just use an internal certificate from an internal CA. We don't need to purchase certificates. And it would allow users to send protected messages to one another, protect attachments, it would prevent internal employees from forwarding protected attachments out to the internet, to internet recipients. So that could be useful. When we get into multi-forest situations, it's going to become a little bit more complex, but if the multiple forests are still inside your organization, if you've implemented multiple forests, then it can still be done. That's usually going to be done by implementing AD RMS in one or both forests, and then using what are called trusted user domains or trusted publisher domains. Basically, since AD RMS is integrated into Active Directory, if you have AD RMS servers in completely separate Active Directory forest, then the licenses issued by RMS server in Forest 1 are meaningless to Forest 2. And so users in Forest 2 can't consume this content because they don't trust the license server or the RMS server, and it gets problematic, right? You can use it on an extranet. If you are using AD RMS and trying to communicate with people outside of your organization, I will just say this from the outset, the complexity level goes way up. It's complex enough when you are implementing it internally, just because of all the moving parts and the different licenses and certificates. But when you start moving outside of your organization, then it becomes more complicated. Okay, at the very least, if you move it outside your organization, your AD RMS server has to be accessible from the internet, where it didn't have to be accessible from the internet before. And you're going to need a public SSL certificate, where you didn't necessarily need one before. So that's at the very least, and that doesn't sound too overly complicated, but think about what the RMS server does when it receives a request. Well, when it receives a request to consume content, the very first thing it does is authenticate the user. How are we supposed to go about authenticating people who are outside of our organization? We don't know who they are. They don't have an identity that's meaningful to my domain controller. I don't have user accounts for them in AD. So there we go. There, the complexity level starts going up. And that's kind of what you deal with a little bit on an extranet, although on an extranet, you're still predominantly dealing with your own people. When you get into, partner to partner type of situations, or our organization to consumer, then it gets much more complicated. Now, partner to partner, the easiest way of doing this is with ADFS. Because if we have a federated trust, we can integrate AD RMS and ADFS together and then that will be useful. And that's especially useful if one of the organizations does not have rights management services. If both organizations have rights management services, then the partner-to-partner type of situation is the same as you with multiple forests, trusted user domains and trusted publisher domains. And if you're trying to send outside your organization to just general users, like, for instance, customers, you want to send account statements, but you want the account statement to be read-only. You also want to make it sure that only this person is able to access it. That starts getting really dicey because, how are you supposed to identify them without creating accounts? So one way of doing it would be to implement a perimeter forest and create customer accounts in the perimeter forest, and that's where they're authenticating. The easiest way of doing it is to quote unquote federate with Microsoft so that anybody with a Windows Live ID, which is just a Microsoft account at this point, would be able to authenticate. That's the easiest way of doing it. I will tell you a couple instances where I was consulting and we were considering doing this for organizations. They went away from AD RMS because of the complexity level, because they were trying to use it with people outside the company. That being said, the outside the company thing is much, much easier with Azure. If you deploy Azure RMS, it's going to be a lot easier to do that. In fact, almost everything is easier. And I sound like it's a big advertisement for Azure. But the cloud is great to a certain extent because you get these really complex infrastructures, you get these really complex setups, and the functionality they're providing is great, but the workup to it is unreal. And then all of a sudden, Microsoft's just going to offer this as a cloud-based service. Let them handle it. You get the functionality, you pay them, and sure, you're going to pay for it, but how much would you pay to implement and maintain the infrastructure? So, again, we're going back to that same thing. Just evaluate that. Definitely look at that because that eliminates a lot of these trust issues. So, point in this was just to say, hey, there's a lot of different scenarios. You got to figure out who you're trying to share content with. That's going to determine whether the servers need to be accessible from the outside or just the inside. That's going to determine or help to determine how we're going to authenticate them. We have to think of all those things as we deploy AD RMS. The installation itself of RMS is not overly difficult. Just like any other role, you install it via Server Manager. It is going to require other roles and features to be in place, but those will be automatically installed for you via Server Manager. That's Web Server IIS, Windows Process Activation Services, Message Queuing, and the Windows Internal Database, although you do have the option to use a SQL Server database, but Windows Internal would be the default. Additional requirements are that you do need to be a member of an Active Directory domain. You do need a separate service account, and that account has to have been created prior to the installation. So the installation does not create it for you. You need to create it. Group Managed Service account would be the best. SQL Server, if you have multiple servers that are going to exist in your cluster, you have to have SQL Server. If you have a single server, then you can use the Windows Internal Database, but you'll be using SQL if you install multiple servers. Now, initially, you're not going to install multiple servers in the cluster, but you can add additional servers to the cluster after the fact. So you want to plan ahead for that and just install and implement a SQL Server or a SQL Server database for this purpose. Once the role is installed, then you'll go into the initial AD RMS configuration. First thing is to create a new cluster, unless it's a second or third server and you're joining an existing cluster. Then the location of the configuration database, the service account that you are going to utilize. Again, we're just pointing to one that exists. Cryptographic mode, key storage, and password. We don't usually change those things. The defaults are fine. The website and address of the cluster, which is the server name by default. We're specifying the licensor certificate, and then we can either do manual service connection point registration or we can allow it to be done automatically. Automatically would be the default. So all of this is really a part of the initial configuration wizard, and it walks you right through the process. Once it's been installed, there is some ongoing management potentially that would need to be done, and then there's some stuff, towards the end of an AD RMS lifetime. So backup and recovery strategies, there's a lot that needs to be backed up. The private keys and certificates should all be exported and backed up to an alternative location so that if we lose those, we have the ability to recover them. The AD RMS database, if you're not using some form of high availability in SQL that replicates the database to multiple locations, then we want to do backups of that. And then the RMS templates, these are the rights policy templates that actually allow us to protect content. We'll go into that a little bit more in the next section, but those would need to be backed up as well. Decommissioning and removing AD RMS is there's some very specific steps to that process. And this might just be an individual server, or it may be the entire thing, okay? And what you have to think about is that there is protected content out there, and that protected content requires that these applications communicate back with this server. So you know, we're not going to go through every step, but I mean, it involves a lot of you know, reissuance of licenses and recreation of this content, trying to make sure that these systems have either expired, or these documents have either expired, or they can be, you know, opened with another server. Now, if you're just removing one server in the cluster, it's not that big of a deal. But if you're removing an entire RMS cluster, that's going to be a bigger deal. Monitoring AD RMS, there are various reports, statistics reports, health reports, troubleshooting reports. They're all available within the AD RMS console. And then, you know, another management would be implementing external sharing, which we said is going to be not problematic, but a little bit more complicated in what you are needing to do. So you've got those different options that we mentioned. Just to rehash those options, because I kind of talked about them with the scenarios. Here we have them listed out. These are the options for sharing content with external users. They're going to vary based on the scenario. The first is trusted user domains, and the second is trusted publishing domains. So just think about that. Trusted user domain would be set up on an RMS server. It would be an outgoing trust to another domain where you're basically saying, I'm going to trust this domain, and they're going to authenticate their users, and their users are going to be able to consume my RMS protected content. Okay, it's not the same thing as an Active Directory domain services trust, but it's that kind of concept where I'm going to allow them to access my information. I'm going to treat them like authenticated users. That is a trusted user domain. A trusted publishing domain is the reverse. Okay, because remember, we said these users can't consume content protected by my RMS server if they don't have, they can't do that. So we would have to set up a trusted publishing domain. Now, mind you, these trusts imply that RMS is enabled in both places. And I think I mentioned that, but again, we're just kind of rehashing and summarizing here. So both trusted user and trusted publishing domains are a component that are actually created within RMS. And so RMS has to exist in both places, because that's where their RMS server is trusting our RMS server and I'm a trusted publishing domain. So it's going to allow their users to consume my content, and potentially vice versa. Okay. Then you have the federated trust. Federated trusts just integrate with ADFS, and so RMS is really the application then that can be shared between those organizations. And then, as I said, the Microsoft accounts are others. But Azure RMS provides the ability to overcome some of the challenges that are related to sharing content externally. So, you know, I mentioned a lot of that in that scenario screen, forgetting that I had put this slide here. So anyway, that's a good way to summarize the implementation of RMS, because one of the biggest questions is, going back to what we said at the start, you know, where and how is it actually going to be used?